Imagine waking up on what should have been an ordinary August morning. The small town of Oakville, Washington, was just beginning another quiet day. Dark clouds drifted slowly across the sky, and the weather forecast predicted nothing more than light rain. Residents prepared for work, children got ready for school, and farmers stepped outside expecting weather they had experienced countless times before. Storms were part of life here. Rain was nothing unusual. No one could have imagined that this ordinary rainfall would soon become one of the most mysterious weather events ever reported in the United States. As the first drops began falling, everything seemed perfectly normal. Windshields collected tiny beads of water. Roofs echoed with the familiar sound of rain. The streets slowly darkened beneath the passing storm. For several minutes, nobody noticed anything unusual. Then, little by little, people began looking more closely. Something was different. The droplets clinging to cars, sidewalks, rooftops, and freshly cut grass weren't behaving like water. Instead of running off smooth surfaces, they remained exactly where they landed. Curious residents stepped outside to investigate. What they found wasn't hail. It wasn't melting ice. It wasn't anything they had ever seen before. Scattered across the town were thousands of tiny, translucent blobs with the appearance of clear gelatin. Some were no larger than raindrops. Others were about the size of small coins. When touched, they stretched between people's fingers before slowly breaking apart, leaving behind a slippery residue unlike anything anyone could identify. Word spread quickly throughout Oakville. Neighbors called one another outside. Drivers stopped their cars to take a closer look. People gathered in small groups, pointing toward the strange substance covering lawns, vehicles, rooftops, and fences. At first, the mood was one of curiosity rather than fear. Perhaps it was an unusual weather phenomenon. Perhaps it had drifted in from a nearby factory. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. But as the morning continued, those simple explanations became harder to believe. No factory reported an accident. No weather service had ever documented rainfall like this. And no one could explain why the mysterious gelatin seemed to have fallen directly from the sky. What had begun as an ordinary rainy morning had quietly transformed into a mystery unlike anything the town had ever experienced. Yet no one realized that the falling substance itself was only the beginning. Because within hours, the people of Oakville would begin reporting something far more disturbing. By the afternoon, the strange rainfall had become the only topic of conversation in Oakville. Residents continued discussing the mysterious substance, trying to come up with explanations that made sense. Some believed it had been carried by unusual weather patterns. Others suspected pollution from a distant industrial plant. A few even joked that it had to be some kind of practical joke. No one imagined that the real mystery was only beginning. Within the next 24 hours, something unexpected started happening throughout the town. People who had been outside during the rainfall began feeling unwell. At first, the symptoms seemed ordinary enough to dismiss: a sore throat, persistent coughing, burning eyes, a slight fever. Most assumed they had simply caught a seasonal virus. But as more residents reported nearly identical symptoms, concern quickly began to spread. Entire families who had touched the gelatinous substance described feeling sick within hours. Some reported dizziness. Others experienced nausea and unusual fatigue. Parents became especially worried as children started developing similar symptoms after playing outdoors beneath the strange rainfall. Doctors suddenly found themselves treating multiple patients whose illnesses appeared to have one thing in common. Every one of them had been exposed to the mysterious substance that had fallen from the sky. Although none of the symptoms were immediately life-threatening, the pattern was impossible to ignore. People who had never met one another, living in different parts of town, were describing remarkably similar experiences. The coincidence became increasingly difficult to explain. As concern spread through Oakville, local authorities began receiving calls from anxious residents asking the same question: what exactly had fallen under their town? No one had an answer. There were no weather alerts, no reports of chemical spills, no aircraft accidents, no official warnings from state or federal agencies. The silence only deepened the mystery. For many residents, curiosity was now giving way to genuine unease. Some carefully collected samples of the strange gelatin in sealed containers, hoping scientists might identify it. Others washed their cars, cleaned their windows, and avoided touching anything that had been exposed to the rainfall. Yet despite every effort to understand what had happened, the substance remained completely unexplained. The town was now facing two mysteries instead of one. What was the strange material? And could it somehow be connected to the growing number of illnesses? The search for answers was about to move beyond eyewitness accounts. Soon, the mysterious blobs would arrive in a laboratory, and scientists would discover something no one expected. As concern continued growing throughout Oakville, residents began preserving samples of the mysterious substance whenever they could. Some carefully sealed the gelatin inside small plastic containers. Others stored it in glass jars, hoping that someone, somewhere, would finally explain what had fallen from the sky. The samples soon found their way into laboratories, where scientists prepared to examine one of the strangest materials they had ever encountered. At first glance, the substance appeared almost harmless. It was nearly transparent, soft to the touch, without any noticeable odor. Nothing about its appearance immediately suggested that it posed any danger. But appearances can often be deceptive. Researchers began placing tiny portions of the gelatin beneath powerful microscopes, expecting to identify a familiar biological material. Instead, they found something entirely unexpected. Embedded within the gelatin were microscopic structures that didn't resemble ordinary rainwater contamination. According to several reports that circulated after the event, laboratory examinations identified two different types of bacteria. One reportedly resembled Pseudomonas fluorescens, a bacterium commonly found in soil and water. The other was described as belonging to the Enterobacter group, bacteria that can also occur naturally in the environment. The findings immediately raised more questions than they answered. How could living bacteria become trapped inside a gelatinous substance that witnesses claimed had fallen directly from the sky? If the reports were accurate, where had the material originated before reaching Oakville? Scientists found themselves confronting an uncomfortable reality. The laboratory had successfully identified organisms within the substance, but identifying bacteria did not explain the substance itself. It answered one question, while creating several new ones. Could the bacteria have contaminated the gelatin after it landed? Had they already been inside it while it was still falling through the atmosphere? Or was the mysterious material carrying them from an entirely different source? No conclusion satisfied every piece of evidence. As news of the laboratory findings slowly spread, public curiosity intensified. The mystery was no longer confined to a small Washington town. Researchers, journalists, and investigators from outside the region began paying attention. And with growing attention came something else: theories, lots of them. Some were grounded in science, others stretched far beyond the available evidence. Separating fact from speculation was about to become far more difficult, because once people cannot explain an event, their imagination often rushes in to fill the silence. By now, one thing had become painfully clear. Something unusual had happened over Oakville. The mysterious gelatin had been seen by numerous residents, samples had been collected, and laboratory reports had added even more questions to an already baffling case. But identifying bacteria was not the same as explaining the event itself. The central mystery remained exactly where it had begun. What had actually fallen from the sky? Scientists, investigators, and local residents soon found themselves considering several possible explanations. Some were surprisingly ordinary. Others sounded almost impossible. The first theory focused on the weather itself. Could an unusual atmospheric event have produced the strange gelatin? Nature is capable of extraordinary phenomena. Dust from distant deserts has crossed entire oceans. Ash from volcanic eruptions has circled the globe. Even microscopic organisms can travel vast distances through the atmosphere. Perhaps the substance was simply an extremely rare natural occurrence. It was certainly the most reassuring explanation. But there was a problem. No known weather phenomenon matched what witnesses described. Meteorologists could explain unusual rain, colored rain, even fish and frogs occasionally falling during waterspouts, but gelatinous masses containing reported biological material, that was something entirely different. The weather theory never fully accounted for every reported detail. Another possibility pointed toward human activity. Oakville lies within a region where military aircraft had occasionally operated, and some residents wondered whether the mysterious material could have originated from an aircraft passing overhead. Perhaps an accidental release. Perhaps industrial waste carried by the wind. Or perhaps something far less innocent. The idea quickly attracted public attention. After all, history contains numerous examples of accidental chemical releases and environmental contamination. It wasn't an unreasonable question to ask. Yet, investigators faced another obstacle. No official evidence ever confirmed that aircraft had released the substance over Oakville. No accident reports surfaced. No military agency acknowledged involvement. No documented flight records established a direct connection between aircraft and the mysterious rainfall. The theory remained possible in the minds of some residents, but unproven. As days turned into weeks, the number of explanations continued to grow. Each theory managed to answer part of the mystery. Yet every one of them left important questions unanswered. The evidence refused to fit neatly into a single explanation, and that is often the hallmark of history's most enduring mysteries, not a complete absence of evidence, but evidence that seems to point in several different directions at once. Before long, the story of Oakville would become even stranger, because witnesses began sharing accounts that had little to do with laboratories, and everything to do with what they believed they had seen in the sky. While scientists examined samples inside laboratories, another investigation was quietly unfolding outside them. The people of Oakville continued asking a different question. If the mysterious substance had truly fallen from the sky, what had been above the town that morning? As more residents shared their experiences, several witnesses claimed they had noticed unusual aircraft operating over the area around the time the gelatinous material appeared. Descriptions varied from person to person. Some remembered hearing aircraft engines long before the rainfall began. Others recalled seeing military-style airplanes flying unusually low despite the poor weather conditions. A few believed they had seen multiple aircraft moving across the clouds shortly before the strange substance started falling. None of those accounts by themselves proved that the aircraft had any connection to the incident, but together they added another layer to an already complicated mystery. Could the timing simply have been a coincidence? Or had residents witnessed something more significant without realizing it at the time? Those questions would remain unanswered. As investigators searched for official records, another story began circulating throughout the community. Some residents claimed that military aircraft had been conducting exercises over the Pacific Northwest during that period. Others suggested that routine training operations might explain why airplanes had been seen in the area. Military flights were certainly not unusual. The region had long been home to training routes and military activity, but no publicly available evidence has ever demonstrated that those flights released the gelatinous material over Oakville. Even so, the rumors refused to disappear. With every passing year, they became part of the legend surrounding the case. Some witnesses became increasingly convinced that the event could not have been natural. Others remained skeptical, arguing that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. The town slowly divided into two groups, those searching for explanations, and those convinced that someone already knew the answer. Yet beneath every theory, every debate, and every rumor, one stubborn fact remained unchanged. Nobody had explained how a gelatinous substance containing reported biological material had ended up covering parts of Oakville after a rainstorm. Decades later, that question still had no universally accepted answer. And then investigators uncovered another possibility, one that had nothing to do with aircraft, and everything to do with the military's oldest enemy, biological warfare. As the mystery continued growing, one theory began attracting more attention than any other. It wasn't because investigators had proven it. Quite the opposite. It was because no one could completely rule it out. Some residents began wondering whether the strange rainfall had been connected to military activity taking place over the Pacific Northwest. The idea sounded unsettling, but history gave people a reason to ask difficult questions. During the Cold War, governments around the world had invested enormous resources into understanding biological agents, chemical substances, and methods of protecting both soldiers and civilians against them. Many of those programs remained classified for years. Some became public only decades later. Because of that history, speculation surrounding Oakville quickly expanded beyond ordinary weather explanations. Could the mysterious gelatin have been connected to a military experiment? Had something gone terribly wrong? Or had an unrelated event simply been interpreted through the lens of Cold War fears? No evidence has ever conclusively answered those questions, but the theory continued spreading. One reason was geography. Oakville was located within a region where military aircraft occasionally operated, and for some observers, that seemed more than a coincidence. Another reason was timing. The incident occurred during a period when public awareness of secret government research had grown considerably. By the early 1990s, previously classified Cold War projects had become widely known. People had learned that governments were capable of conducting experiments that earlier generations would have dismissed as impossible. That knowledge changed the way many people interpreted unexplained events. Suddenly, ideas that once sounded unbelievable no longer seemed entirely beyond imagination. Yet despite decades of speculation, investigators repeatedly encountered the same obstacle. There was no official document linking any military operation to the Oakville incident, no declassified report, no confirmed testimony from personnel involved, no physical evidence proving that the gelatin originated from a government program. For every argument supporting the theory, there was another reminding investigators how little verifiable evidence actually existed. That balance between suspicion and proof became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The mystery survived. Not because the answers were obvious, but because the available evidence never completely supported or completely eliminated the competing explanations. And then another possibility entered the discussion, one that sounded less dramatic, yet perhaps even more disturbing. What if the mysterious substance hadn't been deliberately released at all? What if it had come from nature? In a way no one had expected. After examining the more controversial theories, investigators returned to a question that seemed almost too simple. What if the answer wasn't hidden inside military archives or secret experiments, but within nature itself? Throughout history, the atmosphere has transported astonishing things across enormous distances. Powerful winds have carried desert sand across continents. Volcanic ash has circled the globe. Tiny microorganisms have been discovered thousands of meters above Earth's surface. Nature is capable of extraordinary journeys. Could the mysterious substance that fell over Oakville have been one of them? Some researchers suggested that the gelatin might have originated from large accumulations of biological material. One frequently discussed possibility involved masses of microorganisms, algae, or organic matter lifted into the atmosphere before eventually returning to Earth during rainfall. At first glance, the idea seemed surprisingly reasonable. After all, nature often produces phenomena that appear almost unbelievable until science eventually explains them. But once again, the Oakville case refused to fit comfortably into any known category. Witnesses consistently described a thick, gelatinous material rather than ordinary organic debris. Laboratory reports, as they were described, indicated biological components, yet they did not explain how those components had become suspended inside a clear jelly-like substance. Another frequently mentioned possibility involved large flocks of birds. Some researchers have suggested that masses of partially digested biological material released by birds in flight could occasionally produce unusual deposits on the ground. There are documented cases of what has sometimes been called star jelly or other gelatinous substances appearing after storms, though scientists continue debating their exact origins. Could Oakville simply represent an exceptionally rare example of a poorly understood natural phenomenon? Perhaps, but here too, questions remained. The quantity reported by witnesses appeared unusually large. The distribution across parts of the town seemed difficult to explain, and the reported illnesses continued to complicate the picture. Every explanation solved one piece of the puzzle, only to leave another piece behind. That pattern repeated itself again and again and again. It was as though every path investigators followed eventually led to the same destination. Uncertainty. Years passed. Scientists continued debating. Residents continued remembering. Researchers continued searching. But despite decades of discussion, no single natural explanation has achieved broad scientific acceptance as the definitive answer to what happened in Oakville during those remarkable days of August 1994. Perhaps the strangest part of the entire mystery isn't that people proposed extraordinary theories. It's that even the ordinary ones never completely explain the evidence. By now, the mystery had reached a point where facts, memories, scientific reports, and local legends were becoming increasingly difficult to separate. Years passed. The strange rainfall ended. Life in Oakville slowly returned to normal. Children grew up, families moved away, businesses opened and closed. On the surface, It seemed as though the mystery had become nothing more than another unusual chapter in the town's history. But beneath that quiet appearance, the questions never disappeared. For the people who witnessed those remarkable days in the August 1994, the memory remained surprisingly vivid. Many could still remember the exact moment they first noticed the strange substance covering their cars, their gardens, and the streets outside their homes. Some remembered reaching down to touch it. Others remembered the uneasy feeling that followed when friends and neighbors began reporting similar illnesses. It wasn't simply an unusual event. It was something they had lived through. As the years passed, journalists, television producers, authors, and independent investigators began revisiting the case. Each brought new questions, each uncovered forgotten interviews, each proposed fresh explanations. And with every new investigation, the line between documented fact and community memory became slightly more difficult to recognize. Some stories grew larger with time. Details that had once been uncertain were repeated so often that they began sounding like established facts. Other accounts quietly faded away because they attracted less attention. That is something historians encounter surprisingly often. Memory is not a photograph. It changes, it evolves, it fills empty spaces, especially when no definitive answer is ever found. The Oakville incident gradually became more than a local mystery. It became part of American unexplained history. A case discussed in books, television documentaries, radio programs, internet forums, and countless late-night conversations between people fascinated by the unknown. Yet despite all the attention, the central mystery remained remarkably unchanged. No investigation produced a universally accepted explanation. No scientific breakthrough finally solved the puzzle. No forgotten government archive emerged with all the answers. Decades later, researchers examining the case still found themselves standing exactly where the residents of Oakville had stood on that rainy August morning, looking upward, asking the same question. What really fell from the sky? Perhaps the greatest mystery wasn't the gelatin itself. Perhaps it was how a single unexplained event could continue challenging scientists, investigators, and ordinary people for more than 3 decades, because some mysteries slowly disappear as evidence accumulates. Others only become more mysterious with time, and Oakville belongs firmly in the second category. But before we close the case, there's one final question that deserves to be asked. Not, what do people believe happened? But, what does the evidence actually allow us to conclude? By now, nearly every major theory surrounding the Oakville incident has been examined. Some appear convincing at first. Others seem extraordinary from the very beginning. Yet after more than 3 decades, one remarkable fact remains. None of them explain every piece of the puzzle. The weather theories remind us that nature is capable of astonishing phenomena. History is filled with events that once appeared impossible before science eventually uncovered their causes. But no known meteorological process has been widely accepted as an explanation for the gelatinous material reported in Oakville. The biological theories offer another possibility. The reported presence of microorganisms may suggest that the substance originated from a natural source. Yet those findings, as they have been described over the years, still leave unanswered how such a gelatinous material appeared over parts of the town following rainfall. The military theories attract perhaps the greatest public attention, not because they have been proven, but because secrecy naturally invites speculation. History has shown that governments sometimes conduct programs unknown to the public. That reality encourages people to ask difficult questions whenever unusual events occur. Yet, asking questions is not the same as finding evidence. After decades of investigation, no publicly available document has conclusively linked the Oakville incident to any military operation. Then there are the eyewitness accounts. Without them, the Oakville mystery would never have become known outside a small Washington town. Witnesses preserved samples. They described what they saw. They shared what they experienced. Their testimony forms the foundation of the entire case. But memory, while invaluable, is never perfect, especially when people attempt to recall extraordinary events many years later. This is not a criticism of the witnesses. It is simply one of the realities every historical investigation must acknowledge. As investigators, we have to distinguish between what was reported, what was documented, and what was later added through interpretation, discussion, and retelling. That distinction is essential, because once facts and assumptions become mixed together, finding the truth becomes infinitely more difficult. So, what can we honestly say? We can say that numerous residents reported a strange gelatinous substance following rainfall. We can say that samples were reportedly examined. We can say that illnesses were reported by some residents after the event. We can say that investigators explored multiple explanations. And we can say that none has achieved universal acceptance. Everything beyond that requires caution. Perhaps one day, new evidence will emerge. Perhaps forgotten records still exist. Or perhaps the true explanation was so ordinary that it simply escaped notice. History has surprised us before. It may surprise us again. Until then, the Oakville incident remains suspended in that rare place where documented events end and unanswered questions begin. More than 30 years have passed since that quiet August morning in Oakville. The rain eventually stopped. The roads dried. The gelatinous substance disappeared. Life moved on. Yet the questions never did. For decades, scientists, journalists, investigators, and curious minds have returned to the same mystery, each hoping to uncover the one missing piece that would finally make everything fit together. Some searched for answers in laboratories. Others searched military archives. Some trusted eyewitness testimony. Others looked to nature for an explanation. Every path revealed something important. Yet none revealed everything. Perhaps that is what makes this case so extraordinary. Not that every question remains unanswered, but that every answer leaves another question behind. History has always been filled with mysteries. Some were eventually solved. Others slowly faded into legend. And a rare few continue challenging every generation that studies them. The Oakville incident belongs among those rare mysteries. It reminds us that even in an age of satellites, advanced laboratories, and instant communication, the world is still capable of surprising us. There are still moments that resist easy explanations, still events that force us to admit something many people find uncomfortable. We do not know everything, and perhaps that is exactly why mysteries matter. Not because they encourage us to believe extraordinary claims without evidence, but because they remind us to keep asking questions, even when the answers remain just beyond our reach. If one day new evidence finally explains what happened in Oakville, this mystery will become another chapter in scientific history. But until that day, it remains exactly what it has been since the rain first began to fall. An unanswered question, waiting for someone to solve it.